a roundtable discussion with all participants to discuss the issues that could not be discussed in the question and answer sessions of the day. So to address some of the bigger issues, and as we have told before but not always seen during the discussions itself, the aim is really that everyone can participate, so not only those who have been in Bantu studies for more than half of their lives, also the ones who just start or are new in the field, so everyone can have the floor. Just ask for the floor and you will get it. So there are no stupid questions, only stupid answers, so do not hesitate. Of course, today we only had three talks about Proto-Bantu, besides the interesting introduction in the life of Meusen. So normally we would have had 4 sessions. We have 3 on tense and aspect. So this can be a rather short roundtable, so that we have the time to go to the museum for the guided visit, and maybe the time to still have a look in the, if that is possible, a look at the Lolimi room in the linguistic section of the Africa Museum. So we had the talks today by Derek and John, the joint talks on Bantu or Proto-Bantu aspect from a Bantu internal view by Derek, and a Bantu external view, so from Benue Congo, so the view from below, and the bird's eye view on Proto-Bantu tense and aspect from his work, his book of 2008. And the article with Gerard 2006, Derek proposed several possible or confirmed or proposed new possible reconstructions of tense, mainly aspect, and then tense affixes into Proto-Bantu. I think one of the central ideas of this of both talks is that tense, the expression of tense was an innovation, and an innovation typical for narrow Bantu and its closest relatives. John brought up the interesting concept or idea of the Cameroon volcanic line, so as a sort of very old linguistic boundary, a boundary which would have determined or conditioned the isogloss, or this innovation of tense being added to rather aspect oriented or dominated systems. I think we have already discussed it briefly with Derek. Derek brought up some issues of methodology. He referred several times to the frequency of certain morphemes, and used that as an argument not to reconstruct a certain morpheme. He referred to the La future, for instance, which is not frequent but scattered into Bantu. He referred to the high-low tone distinction on the A prefix for past expression, which was reconstructed by Mason into Proto-Bantu, but of which Derek thinks it cannot be reconstructed because not frequent enough. So one can wonder if frequency as such is a sound argument for reconstruction, if it has not rather to do with distribution, and if old archaisms or retentions cannot be scattered but not frequent. So this is maybe something we can discuss from a methodological point of view. And a very clear statement by Derek at the end of his talk, and there we rejoin the discussions we had earlier on Bantu verbal form. Is he said that the agglutinative structure of Bantu or Proto-Bantu as reconstructed by Mason, if I've understood correctly, is rather an innovation. At notes 3 probably in R3, so in the rest of Bantu but excluding Northwest, and that Northwest will be rather conservatively analytic. So this is for Derek and John's talk. John, so he confirmed the hypothesis, or also supported the hypothesis that tense is an innovation, and Bantu innovation of Bantu and narrow closest relatives, and if innovation started in the tense domain, if I've understood correctly, that it would have been rather in the past, and that then other tenses would have followed. So, and in the discussion afterwards, that aspectual innovation, or that the expression of aspect happens within the stem, so rather at the end of the stem, while innovations, tense-related innovations are pre-stem positioned or situated in the pre-stem. And then the third and last talk of today was by Tara. I think she introduced, that was the most innovative talk, of course, because she introduced an issue that has rarely been dealt with within historical Bantu studies. So that's certainly nothing dealt with by Mason, or only very marginally. It's reminiscent of the talk on the middle domain as a semantic domain, so something that is also not central in comparative or historical Bantu studies. So the concept of lexical aspect, and whether or what we could reconstruct with a focus on change of state verbs. So I don't know who wants to open the discussion or pick into one of these, or take up one of these issues for further discussion. So, as without wanting to put any pressure, of course, anyone is welcome to join the floor and to open the discussion.
Can I just say one quick thing about
Yes.
the statistical thing? Yes, I mean, certainly one of the arguments I use is how common is this morpheme? So the future morpheme is not very common. That la is not very common in Bantu, you know. But I was not aware of what John was going to say, that in Grassfield's languages, where there's tense, or the other Bantu languages, there frequently is past, but there isn't a future. You know, so that would also argue, that would kind of buttress the statistical argument that that's not a reconstructible category. That's an innovation rather than being a reconstructed category, because it doesn't exist in some of these other languages, a category of future outside that. And the other thing that struck me, I won't say anymore.
Yeah.
The other thing that struck me was yesterday, Roger's display of extensions. You know, they're very disparate within Bantoid, but they're disparate between Bantoid and Bantu. You know, but when you look at tense marking between what's reconstructible from Bantu and then the stuff that John was showing, oh, it's also very disparate, hugely disparate between Bantu and the Bantoid language, those languages that he was talking about.
Someone who has been trying to describe some of the languages in Eastern Bantu and to maintain that there is no distinction between tense and aspect, is slightly intrigued by the proposal here. Is it possible to suggest that some of the languages, at least present-day languages, have completely gotten rid of aspect and designed the whole system to have tense alone.
No. That's the end of that discussion. I don't think so. Can you think of one?
I would. Runyambo.
Yeah.
Right. Is that like higher?
Yes.
Well, but higher's got plenty of aspects. So there's an
What is the
article by
definition? I mean, there's going to be, most languages will have something like a progressive or a habitual somewhere in it. I mean, but I guess you'd have to be lacking both of those to be strictly tense.
This
Look
is
at
actually.
Henry Mazar.
Is it anger?
Look at Henry Mazar's thesis. There's a thesis on tense and aspect in higher. You're not going to tell me Nyambo's different.
Yes.
But supposing you were to transform the system and say each of those distinctions is a tense distinction, what's wrong with that?
What Larry just said, you know, there are progressives and habituals and so on. Those are aspects. Those are tenses.
Well, it depends on how you draw the distinction then, or you do the definition of tense and
It
aspect.
does seem mostly tense. I agree with you. You know, but there's a little bit of there still is some corner where there's something that's not strictly tense. But I would say that Haya and Runyambo are predominant. If you looked at them, you'd say they really care about tense more than aspect.
Sarah wants to.
Yeah, it's this existential sort of crisis that I'm having is, are we,
Do we need to know?
to what extent do we
Can I help?
even agree on our definitions of these concepts, and how far can we agree on what we think tense is and what aspect is and what the perfective is? Right. Both for a particular language and when we're talking about it, like, do we when I say perfective and when Dmitry says perfective, are we saying the same thing? And I don't think this. I don't know if it is resolved in Bantu, and I don't know if it can be resolved in Bantu. And I think one reason it's quite difficult to talk about is that there's been so little very careful semantic descriptive work of what these categories do. So we can say, well, there's this form function association, but we don't actually know what the function is, and we don't know how we model it. And
May I react to the existential crisis? So just
Only if you reduce it, then.
I hope. Yeah, I'll try to get away with the anxiousness. No, I think one of the big problems is that there is a label for a certain morpheme. So, and if you call it perfective, it doesn't mean that that's the only semantic value that it can express. And so, when you see something is called perfective, it does mean that it is only perfective. So it can also have other meanings. So just because when we talk about about morphemes, we need to choose a label which is short and which you can refer to. So that's that. So there's no existential crisis there. So it just
no, there's not an existential crisis there, but I think there is a thing in Bantu where when people say perfective, and I'm not then talking about what are the functions of the perfective in a particular language, but I think we mean different things when we say perfective, and I don't know that we agree on a model, and I don't know whether we can agree on a model, and I think that makes this kind of semantic work quite difficult. Sorry,
Yes.
Yeah, I would agree with Tara that I do think we use our concepts are not sophisticated enough to actually describe Bantu languages. So, and there's certainly some of it has to be reconstructed. So if we think of the key form, simultaneous subordinate clauses, car form, as a consecutive or sequential. Well, it has been mentioned, I think, by Tara, taxis. So I think it's a very important and central concept for Bantu languages. Namely, it's not absolute time like tense. It's not internal time like aspect. It's relative time, and it seems to be pretty old, but I wouldn't dare to say Proto-Bantu, but then I think already Comrie says that progressive is not just imperfective and the perfect is not just perfective. So I think our machinery to describe verbal categories should be, well, we should work on them, and of course let alone lexical aspect. So I agree. It's
I just have a clarification question as a really non-specialist in this area to what Larry just said. So when you say some languages still have progressive or habitual, does it matter whether they express this through an extension or through like a periphrastic form, or is it the same to you?
No, I wouldn't say so. I mean, what I was, just the intuition I had was if you look at certain Bantu languages like Chiao or Kilega, they clearly have a perfective, imperfective distinction that cuts across, and it's expressed in the verb stem, and that's where the aspect is expected, as we've heard today. In the Haya case, which I remember better than Runyambo, there's all these multiple past tenses and everything like that with the combination of things, because it's all been reanalyzed. So the different endings between a and ile get mixed up in there, but not systematically. You've got prefixes that like a and ka and so forth that are in there. But you also have the difference, maybe I should have said Luganda actually instead, because what you have in Haya is there's this ni, the focus marker that distinguishes a progressive from a non-progressive in the present which doesn't exist in Luganda. So they even care less about that. It's ambiguous whether it's a present habitual or a present progressive now. And in fact, both of those cut across the now versus general. But and then there's an aga that's stuck on only the past, not for a habitual. Past habitual is the distant past with aga, an aga ending. Okay, so there's a little bit still there, but it's not cutting across the different tenses the way that you get in some of the other languages. And then, and I don't know if there are Bantu languages that don't have the tenses. It seems that almost everywhere you've got multiple past tenses. So that seems to be, whenever that was innovated, boy, they went wild with it, So.
Or maybe Kiswahili lost the multiple.
Oh yeah, maybe, okay.
I can add to that. It's not clear. Bantu languages very often have they have one word forms of verbs, and then they have multiple word forms to inflect verbs and express all these things. Are we talking? I mean, I know from Derek sometimes of some of his tables have them mixed up and not mixed up, but have both of them in there at various places. There's even instances of one form occurring in two places to fill up this grid of universal ideas about time and aspect, temporal meanings and aspectual meanings. So I find it difficult, I must say, to reconstruct these super categories which have no forms attached to them. Even in one language not. There's no language which has all imperfective aspects marked by the same thing. I mean, that doesn't really happen very often. And I find it more useful, say, to reconstruct and to describe things, forms and meanings, rather than super categories which have no forms attached to them, and then to discuss which one is dominant and which is not dominant of these super categories. I mean, we don't reconstruct negation as such. We just have one vote on it. Proto-Bantu could negate. Yes, okay, the category was there, I think. But how it worked, and we'll have to talk about morphemes. And then if you have more than one, then we talk about what was the difference in meaning. And how were they used in the morphology or syntax of Proto-Bantu. Thank you.
Yeah, I was about to say something. If we start from the forms that we can reconstruct and then try to describe or reconstruct their function, don't we can't we circumvent the discussion about labels?
To some
I-
extent, maybe, though.
Or and like for the work you, like the Tara, the work you presented, if you start out from actual verbs that are reconstructible to Proto-Bantu, and you try to describe their semantic range or their semantic. So then, okay, you can describe this in any detail. Of course, this has rarely been done in such diachronic semantic studies for specific verbs or specific class of verbs in Bantu. You see, such work is done in Indo-European and very detailed studies, but for Bantu it doesn't exist. But if we would do so, then we can first do the detailed studies, and then we stick a label up onto it just to close the discussion and say.
Yeah, I mean,
let's go.
I agree to some extent, but I think if you won't necessarily ask the right questions if you don't have some kind of a theoretical framework that is.
Yeah, sure.
The interesting
Lutz?
thing I think happens when you find that in your analysis of either a language or comparative data, that the descriptive categories you would like to employ actually don't quite work. So that really pushes it. So I think what you mentioned earlier, what people call phasal polarity, I'm not sure if that's a good term. So what I think what's interesting about that, and goes back to what Tom mentioned earlier with the key, is that there's a number of tense aspect categories which have relations in them, which you don't easily find in the European. It is this still, no longer, not yet, which is grammaticalized in a way which you don't find in the European languages. And for that, it's hard to say this is tense or this is aspect, because it's not, there is an element of locating an event in the timeline, but crucially it's relating that event in the timeline to some other event, which is a similar tense category. But that gives it an aspectual flavor. So I think
Expectation.
if you encounter that sort of system, and then if it's expressed by the same morphem or not, it's a different question. But I think we want to talk about that subset of meaning or form meaning pairings as being hard to describe in a traditional tense aspect system, but that's what makes it exciting, because then you can say, well, that's precisely where our both descriptive apparatus and theoretical apparatus breaks down, because we find that it's hard to express this phenomena, which we think has some semantic coherence. If we think that.
Roger had a question.
Can I
or an observation.
raise a different topic, which is this frequency argument?
Maybe if it's a different topic, maybe Tom first.
Yeah, I think there's one other reason why we should try to be more specific in the functional descriptions, because we know that in Bantu is good because it's so many languages and there has been so much change, also functional change with one and the same element. And we need to know is one element of the same form but very different functions actually cognate with each other, and then how to relate these different functions to each other. And then we have to say, okay, this key in that language is this, and this key in that language is cognate, but is that, and so I don't think we, as you say, Kuhn, we just look for cognacy and then we stick a label to something. I mean, if we want to understand the trajectory of individual elements, we need to, kind of make up our mind what something is. So the key is can be persistive, can be simultaneous taxis, can be. I mean, I have written about this key has many different functions, and you can show actually that a specific function goes to this function, goes to this function, and this says something about also the development in the.
Yeah, but you start out from one.
Yeah, but you need to know what develops to what. So you need to know does aspect go to tense or etc. etc. So I don't think we get around in saying something about function in a more principled way.
To relate to what was being said over there, and one of the things that came out in Roger's talk yesterday about extensions was directionality, directions. Yeah, that's a function of ka. Right? I mean, it's in that tree, the template of mine, rather doubtfully under aspect. But it's not really an aspect at all. It's a directional. Essentially. away from the here and now, away from
Can I raise my point now?
Yeah, but if, are there any, yeah, we'll come. Are there any other additional comments to this discussion or deep thoughts, existential questions? Existential, Marcus, that's tomorrow. It's tomorrow. Roger, you can raise your point.
Okay. Frequency. It seems to me frequency is an entirely spurious argument for logical reasons, if none else. It seems to me something could be widespread in Bantu or whatever, and yet not present in the key areas up in the northwest, and is therefore not reconstructible, despite being, you know, of high frequency. But I've been very impressed. I've been thinking about Gerard's argument about Booby, and I checked the Booby data myself, and you know, suppose that indeed a very early branch like Booby shows that there are intriguing similarities to Eastern Bantu, and that is much more synthetic than analytic. Suppose therefore that what happens in the northwest is entirely misleading, that, you know, a language like Booby does represent something very close to Proto-Bantu, and it's because it's been isolated, it's kept these features which are then transmitted to the east and disappear in the heartland of Bantu, and so on. So all these things make me think that, I mean, there are possible models, and that turns the usual idea upside down, which is that what happens in the northwest is, you know, closer to Proto-Bantu, maybe not. In fact, what happens in the northwest is remote from Proto-Bantu. I don't know the resolution to this one yet. But I do know that frequency arguments seem to me entirely spurious. They can't tell you what might be reconstructible just because it's common, so what? It's not relevant. That's not reconstruction.
Yeah, I also wanted to raise this point, and in particular, I would like to know what people think about this conflict between, if a feature is very widespread across many branches within a family, should it be reconstructed or not, and how does that relate to, say, Occam's razor or parsimony principle, that you would posit that because you find it in a lot of places, it was there when the proto-language, before the proto-language split apart, so that you don't have to posit the same change over and over again. And whether one of these two things might have more relevance depending on what feature you are looking at or what you're trying to reconstruct. For example, in Indo-European, I think gender has been reconstructed back to Proto-Indo-European, is that right? So that whatever grammaticalization led to, gender or case, to the development of those two categories, it was posited as being already there in the proto-language. And if we look at branches today, they're pretty much everywhere. Somewhere it has been lost. But so how does that, if a feature is frequent, it could well be that it could be reconstructed back to the initial stage of a family, or it could be that there was a series of independent parallel innovations. So what do people think about this?
Or it spread real fast.
Yes, or it's
So,
spread.
you know, it does, you're just, you were just talking about convergence, but maybe some things can spread really fast and therefore, take up a lot of area.
But isn't spread also related to time and space? So if you have a feature that is like in a huge area, like I'm talking about the whole of Central and Southern Africa, but can you assume that it spread in like 100 years over that entire area? So I think it's related also to that.
I only know that some changes can spread much faster than others, and I can, a good example from English is people used to, when they're quoting direct speech, say, so he goes or she goes, and that's how it became, he's like, I'm like, and then introducing the quote. And that, in a couple of years it was everywhere. It was all over the States, it was in England, it was in Australia. I don't know of anything like that in Bantu, but it shows that it can happen.
Yeah, but there isn't any Bantu language that has the
No,
global
Proto-Bantu.
status of English. So
But I think that there is well, you raise it actually in your comment, but we should distinguish, and I don't know, in Derek's work or what he showed us today, there is frequency in terms of absolute numbers, but you raised it. That's a difference as there's difference between frequency and distribution over branches of a family. So something can be frequent but also represented in all branches of the family, and there our family tree becomes important again. So it can be very frequent but absent from the northwest, or very frequent but absent from one key area, and then I think that you have distribution and frequency both can coincide. But if something is, I would say, infrequent like La, but you find at the stations in all branches, sub-branches of narrow Bantu, I would tend to say this is a typical, like, archaic distribution. And certainly if you find it in the outliers, it's something. It had more time to disappear than an innovation. So no, it's so that. So I think there's a difference between frequency and distribution over the sub-branches of a family.
So I would like first to second your opinion that there's a difference between distribution and frequency, but then the second point is to try to answer the question of Sarah of how do you decide whether it's something is frequent in all the branches. I mean, as far as I understand how comparative method works, I mean, the answer is it depends. It depends on the data. For instance, like if you have in every branch you have a certain marker, and you assume that it should be reconstructed. But if you can't show if you can show that the reflexes in each of these branches or in many of these branches are irregular, they don't correspond to each other, then you should assume that they are not reconstructible through the proto-language, but they are innovated separately. Sometimes you can show that, sometimes you can't. And if you can't show that, you can assume that probably it was reconstructible. It is reconstructible with the proto-language, but you may be wrong. So if you happen to have historical data, you may see that sometimes we do the best we can have with the data, but the frequency is such. I mean, it's too abstract. So you need to look at data. So the answer, it depends. Right. And it depends on particular forms and how you can do the correspondence in between the forms.
And I agree, and I think that the comparative method is great if you just focus mostly on form, but it has limitations if you want to go into functions. So I'm thinking about the applicative, and there are multiple functions attached to what synchronically looks at one
but I mean, if there are limitations which are inherent to the method, then you have to invent a new method, or you have to accept that you can't reconstruct certain things.
And I'm willing to do that, but what I'm saying is I don't think there is, unfortunately, one correct answer to saying it's very frequent, it is distributed everywhere, therefore it should be reconstructed back to
sometimes
the highest node. Or sometimes I've heard people saying, oh, it has a scanty distribution within a certain tree, that is the thing that should be reconstructed versus something that is attested everywhere. I don't think that, neither of those two arguments makes a strong case for anything. It's probably a case-by-case situation in which you have to evaluate and also compare with, I don't know, what has been done elsewhere, where probably there's more historical data that can be accessed.
Yeah, and when you haven't done reconstruction, so just looking at the lower clades and seeing different morphemes, you can do guesses, but it still remains guess.
Sure.
If we stick to the applicative, if your hypothesis is that it evolved from focus to syntax and then to semantics, and this focus function, in contrast to the two others within Bantu, is much more scanty, it's much more
Yeah.
patchy. That for me that would be rather good evidence that this is a relic function that which has disappeared. So it ties the different types of arguments tie into to reinforce a hypothesis. So I often hear people raise it's parallel innovation, but I find this, if you can't show it, I mean, that's the easy way out. It's parallel innovation, yes, okay, but that's not the most economical explanation. So for me, the most economical explanation is always retention. It's a retention unless you can show the other way around.
Because you need to posit the least number of changes.
Yeah, they
because
just
of our
kept it,
constraints.
and the other.
Yeah.
It's
What
easier
Larry
to.
yesterday had with the past.
We could go into the
But,
question
I
of
mean,
define
that's-
economical.
Lutz.
Just two things. I think so on the applicative example, it seems to me that that's another classic element of the comparative method. By when you look at phonological changes, you look at naturalness or markedness, or people look at sonority type elements. So if you have a good story that you have a likely change from P to H, or you can choose between H to P and P to H, you would choose P to H because you think that's more frequent. Now, in your case, your argument, if I understand from correctly, is that you have good reasons to think that there's development from the focus function to the syntax function, semantic function. So that's very strong. So if you combine that with the distribution, but it's that argument which is really the interesting one, I think. And I think for the applicative that sounds very right. And the second thing I just wanted to mention is I think distribution is important across the tree, but then the flip side is distribution in the geography. So that's where you get the contact effect. So I don't know if Rosen talked about the bar passive, and I don't know if my facts are right, but at some stage people thought that the bar passive, you can see very neatly that it's sort of scattered in a sort of curve going from the Atlantic sort of maybe to southern Tanzania, and that looks like a contact zone. And it's not it's not distributed across trees and things, but that really looks like that people borrowed that, but maybe my data are outdated. But that was a classic argument for saying what you see there is really more recent contact phenomenon.
Yeah, but we had this discussion elsewhere. But I mean, that ties in with what Sebastian is saying. I mean, for something to spread across Bantu, if that's over huge distances, and I don't know, there must be some historical or there must be a historical scenario underlying. There must be it must correspond with a trade route or with a kingdom or with otherwise. For me again, it's an easy explanation to say it's contact induced and it's a spread zone, and yeah, but what's the story behind then? I mean, so if something spreads from Cameroon to Kenya, I don't see. I mean, that's somehow how to account for it. Yes, Tom.
Yes, because well, of course, I happen to hear this pretty often. I think that depends on the feature. So if you have clicks in a cluster distribution, you won't argue about that this is very likely contact, because the more marked the feature is, the less likely it is that it just pops up independently multiple times with a biased geographical distribution. So there's one point.
So then you mean clicks in Dahalo and in Southern Africa? Or you
No,
mean
no.
Clicks within Southern.
Let's say the bar passive would be universally extremely, which is not the case, but let's assume that would be a universally or cross-linguistically extremely rare passive strategy. And then it turns out that it's clustered in a certain area.
It's a morpheme, it's not a strategy.
But that's I'm just saying. One should admit that depending on the markedness of a feature, a contact scenario can do without evidence for contact. So this is one point. And the other thing is, nobody is asking for the presence of the sociolinguistic necessities for feature transfer from one speaker generation to another. to claim that languages are related to each other. So I think explaining isoglosses and demanding a contact explanation, I want to have evidence for contact. Nobody is doing the same thing when we claim that languages are related to each other. So I think it's really, there's a kind of bias when we argue about historical linguistics. For contact, we want independent, non-linguistic evidence, and that two languages are closely related to each other. Nobody shows that actually there were two speech communities likely at one point in time, space, and with this condition of speech transfer from mother to children generation. So that is a problem, I think, in historical linguistics.
Not if you're doing reconstruction. I mean.
Well, let's assume you see a nice isogloss of a Bantu language in Tanzania, and one in or enough isogloss between a language in Tanzania and one distantly somewhere else. You would easily go that they are related to each other because you think the features are, but nobody asked, was it ever likely that there was a common proto-language, geographically, and those languages split, etc. So that's what I mean.
The intriguing cases are those where you do have something in the language which is marked, so it's not likely to be innovated just like this, and still it is very isolated and frequency is very low, and you can't find. I mean, thinking of, say, nasality in Ubuntu, or well, I'll leave it at yeah. I think I got this from Larry. And Larry, at one time you said, if a language has something that most other languages seem to be very well able to do without, go on and dig. You'll find something interesting there, or you have a chance to find something interesting there.
What I usually say is, if you have something that other languages can do very well without, then that raises the question, where did they get it from?
Yeah. Yeah.
And we don't say, where did they get their ah from? We don't ask for their PTK or something.
Yeah, yeah. But we do have things which are very, very rare. Like say the locative knee. I mean, I've been thinking about this. It's certainly the same thing. I mean, it's so similar. It is spread. It has a spread which no one thinks is a particular group of language, a branch of languages. I mean, or you have Dahl's law, which is also well, we do have parallels, but in the world, but it is. But again, it's not linked to any plausible branch.
No, Dahl's law.
Well, it doesn't occur outside, but there's lots of languages within that branch that don't have it and have no traces of it, and if they have, then it's all loans from Swahili. So, yeah, we don't know what to do with these, and of course the easiest thing is to say it's in retention, but in this case, no. I mean, in these cases, maybe John Stewart has said nasality in Ubuntu is a retention, and he has some nice reconstructions that carry it on, and some of them I find convincing. But I feel a bit nervous about changing the Proto-Bantu BLR3 and putting a question mark with every word that is not on John Stewart's list to say whether these vowels were nasalized or not. What's the use? I mean,
that's next
Kilo,
year.
what do you think about Bruce Connell's argument about fricative vowels, for example?
For example, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it's again something that's very rare.
Tested in Mambaloid and tested in Fang group languages, right? And Bruce argues for cognates. No, I don't know.
Yeah,
What do you think?
Mm-hmm.
But that is just giving a phonetic interpretation to what we already have, right? And that isn't going to affect very much. The nasalized vowel one is much more dramatic.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Can I come back to the talks today? I wanted to ask, because Roger said something made me think, bringing up that there are multiple past tense languages in Kainji and Plateau, and then I also found them in Gwari, and I'm trying to figure out from this ethnologue map of Nigeria if it would be possible for the multiple tense languages of Cameroon and Bantu to have swung around the other ones that John talked about, and make a continuous isogloss, so to speak, stopping somewhere in Kainji, I guess, unless it keeps going into Boer. I don't. We don't have a. I don't know. Do we have a map of where you find multiple past tenses in sub-Saharan Africa? I'd be interested in seeing what it looks like. Because that's one point. The other point about it was, I hope no one got the impression from the discussion about aspect versus tense that there's something unusual about tense or secondary about it, in the sense that it would be just as reasonable to think that these other languages independently introduced tense, rather than that it had to be a continuous wave, because it's very natural to have tense. But I was just curious, I can't tell from this map, which, if I can get around Jukunoid and all that, here it's not that clear, but I wonder if they I'm just curious as to why we've got it over here and then throughout everybody going east, or if that's just an accident.
She means to argue that Jukunoid expanded from the south, that originally all the core languages, which are the languages that have the proper noun class systems and all that, they're in the far south, and they pushed north. So they would have pushed the Plateau and other out of the way, which previously would have been more continuous. So there is a possible argument for that.
Okay. It's 4 o'clock, we could stop here.
Yeah.
But if there are very urgent issues, like if you say won't be able to follow the guided tour when I don't ask this question, or I don't get an answer to this worry or this query, no. Well,
Perhaps, but a totally different thingy. Maud, so your very first talk this morning. Is there a way we can help you in terms of finances, in terms of human resources, and what do you need? So I'm talking about the archive of A.E. Mason, which is locked away, and we would like to unlock it.
Yes.
Do you have ideas or needs? Or should I ask Jackie?
For a round table, I think. Yes, please give me some money and some. Can anyone help?
British Library Endangered Archives Programme, have you applied to them?
What?
British Library has this thing called Endangered Archives Programme, which gives grants to preserve archives.
Sorry, I didn't get the beginning.
British
of
Library
okay.
Endangered Archives Programme.
These aren't endangered.
also in Europe?
They're not endangered enough for that.
Brexit? These would count as endangered under this.
No. This building was, these buildings are nice.
You see the lights during the lights?
Brexit?
No, you need water through the roof. I know this. They don't want to fund stuff in the first world.
But in a way, we're talking digitizing legacy data, and we don't know what's in it. There may be endangered languages. They may be moribund. They may be gone already. We don't know. Well, we know a bit, but.
Yeah. Well, it's not.
So
like
it
we
depends.
don't
If you write your
know what's in it.
application well,
Mhm.
is that a route?
Yes. Yeah.
What did you say? I didn't. What is it?
We'd like to digitize material.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the modern way to get to access to it.
Mhm.
Hmm? Because in some publications you will see personal notes of, in your book, Tense and Aspect, there are many notes that you refer to, but they're not really accessible to the others.
Digitizing, as we know from LA, also not a guarantee.
Precisely.
That's why after digitizing you submit it to an archive. So you have to go one of these routes, Max Planck or SOAS. Is that an option?
SOAS one. They'll burn it.
But I think what might be more exciting is a European project where we combine different things. So I wasn't at the talk this morning, but SOAS, we have lots and lots of boxes of lots of very interesting people who did very interesting things. And they are sitting there, and some we know what's in it, some we don't. So there's certainly scope for digitizing.
Yes.
I mean, even go through. Let's three papers we have.
And it would be clearly in his spirit, like wanting to share and have data out there. I mean, so that's clear. So yeah.
You British.
Both of you are German.
Give it a try.
March deadline.
Okay, any other contributions to this topic or any further thoughts and any further remarks? No? Well, I think I can give the floor then to either Jackie or Maud for the rest of the program. Thanks for attending the scientific the discussion so far, but not that it's not scientific what is following. But for tomorrow, if we won't be together anymore, I think we start again at 9:30. If I'm 9, yes. Wow. 9, and so we start immediately in the faculty council room, so in our not round table room. So that's the whole session tomorrow and Friday. No, we'll be in the Blondin, so in where we did the quiz yesterday, or where we had the round table discussion the two evenings. Yeah, you have been there before.
Yes.
But it's Blondin at 2. Well, yes, or should we meet in front of the other entrance and then go there together tomorrow? No, okay. We don't want anyone to get lost, of course. Okay, tomorrow 9 o'clock sharp in Blondin.
Yeah.